Okay, so to review for your upcoming Middle Ages test, have basically put together my general overview of everything we went over in the Middle Ages unit, which is what I'm going to go over in this video. So I'm going to go over all the topics on the review, on the test, and kind of go over them pretty fast. So if you have questions or you're still confused about something, email me, let me know. But I'm just going to get right into it because there's a lot to go over. So to start with, kind of the main topic or the main theme that we've looked at over the course of this unit over the Middle Ages was this system of feudalism, which was the social and political structure of medieval Europe. Following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Western Europe came to organize itself under the system of feudalism. And if we look at the system of feudalism, there are a number of important traits to recognize. First off, probably the most defining feature of this system is its heavy emphasis on rigid social classes with no social mobility. So what this means is that a lot of what you do and what your role in life is determined by your social class. And since there's no social mobility, your social class is determined by birth, meaning that whatever class you're born in, you're stuck. So if you're born a peasant, you're going to stay a peasant. There's no way to move up in this system. Looking at the social classes, there were really kind of five, which we'll look at the four in the main hierarchy, and then I'll add the clergy on later. So at the very top of the basic hierarchy, you have the king, you have the royalty. Beneath the king was the nobility, or more specifically, the upper nobility, the large landowners. Beneath the upper nobility, you had lower nobility, or knights. So these would be smaller landowners who got their fiefs or their land not directly from the king, but from a higher ranking noble. Or in the case of a knight, somebody who got his land from a noble in exchange for him pledging military service to his lord, to that higher ranking noble, to his lord. And then at the very bottom, and the biggest class by far, you have the peasants. And when I say biggest, roughly 90, if not more, probably more than 90% of people during the Middle Ages were peasants. And then kind of going along with this to the side, you have clergy, or religious officials within the Catholic Church. Fundamentally, there were three groupings, or three separate groups of classes in this society, depending on what their function was. So you had those who worked, the peasants, those who prayed, the clergy, and those who fought, the king and the nobility and the knights. So that's just the general way that they were kind of divided up. Again, even though there were more social classes pertaining to those who fought or the nobility, by far the biggest social group of the period were peasants. And the way these classes interacted with each other, really you have two basic interactions or exchanges going on. The most basic one, the one that kind of sets the bedrock for everything else, is this one. Peasants work nobles' land in exchange for protection. This is probably the most important function of feudalism and the most important thing to understand in order to understand feudalism. So if you put yourself in the position of the average person in Western Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, things were pretty chaotic. There was no centralized government or authority anymore. The economy and trade had basically collapsed. There were these raiders moving around, attacking and raiding cities and villages. And in general, it was just chaos. In the midst of this chaos, people wanting some stability and protection turned to the only real viable sources of protection they could find. These wealthy landowners living on their own estates out in the countryside, who had enough wealth and resources to arm and equip their own private armies. And basically, there was this general exchange that emerged here where you have peasants who would be allowed to live on this landlord's or this noble's land. They would work for him, and he would get most of what they grew or what they made, and they would also have to pay him taxes to live on his land. But in exchange, they could live on his land. They were allowed to keep a portion of what they grew or what they made. And in the event they were attacked, the noble would use his army to protect them. So fundamentally, this is the exchange that, one, kind of sets the stage for the rest of feudalism, but also helps explain why the system got started in the first place. The peasants needed protection. The nobles needed workers. So they were effectively helping each other out. It's also worth noting that in addition to having to work for the noble, the peasants also had to give up a number of their rights as feudalism became more entrenched. So, for example, many peasants were not allowed to marry without their lord's permission. Peasants typically were not allowed to leave their lord's manor or his estate without their lord's permission. So the peasants, there were a lot of restrictions put in place on peasants, and they knowingly were agreeing to have a pretty low standard of living. But at least initially, that was an exchange they were willing to make because of the protection they were receiving. And now, over time, as the threat of attack from outsiders declined, this became a much more one-sided relationship where the peasants didn't really need protection because there weren't really any threats, and the nobles were really reaping all the rewards from it. But anyway, so that's the main interaction with feudalism, peasants working nobles' land in exchange for protection. But then, as feudalism develops and as governments start to take shape again, the kings start to get involved, where the kings would effectively give nobles land and, more importantly, title in exchange for loyalty. So effectively, the king would grant a noble a fief or a plot of land where the noble was lord over. As lord, he was effectively the governing authority over that territory. He had the right to enforce the king's law. He was in charge of collecting taxes. And in general, he could effectively run that territory however he wished, as long as it didn't conflict with the king's law. In exchange for this power and the wealth provided by owning this land, that lord or that noble would become a vassal to the king, meaning he would swear an oath of loyalty to the king and promise to fight for him and serve him whenever called upon. Now, the drawback to this from the king's perspective is that initially, the kings didn't have the power to force the nobles to do anything. The nobles had their own private militaries who were more loyal to their lord than to their king because their lord paid them. So the king did not have the military authority to overthrow the nobility. And since the nobles were independently wealthy, he didn't have the economic ability to force the nobles to do anything either. So even though the king technically had the most power, in reality, his actions were limited to those that the nobles would agree to. So that's something else that's important to keep in mind. Looking at the economy under feudalism, the economy was organized under what was